Hello everyone, this is part 7 of What If Naruto Was a Puppeteer, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to see more, comment down below. He was nervous right now. At least in his head he wasn't. Taking the position of Shunin exam proctor over for Hayate should have been a simple thing, just stand in the arena, say some names, and announce the winners. That should have been it. But no, he had to be standing next to the clearly mentally unstable kid with absolute control over sand, which apparently rivaled Junin assassins from Suna. Gaara just stood there quietly, his face a cold, expressionless mask. Yet somehow the kid was projecting an aura of malice that was making him anxious. It didn't help that the boy's opponent, Anoiki's daughter if he remembered right, hadn't turned up for the exams at all. He wasn't exactly surprised considering what he heard had happened in the preliminary rounds, but still. The redhead next to him only seemed to become more and more agitated, the sand around his feet swirling in both a hypnotic and deeply unsettling manner. His hands were tightening up until his knuckles whitened. On top of all that, because his day couldn't get any worse, the kid was apparently a Jinchuriki. It wasn't as though Konoha could do anything either. No, the kid also had to be the son of the Yondaime Kazekage. If he tried to subdue the kid without him visibly flying off the handle already, then Konoha would be the bad guys in the eyes of the world. Safety obviously came first, that was the Sandaime's viewpoint, but damn if publicity didn't come a close second. If Konoha was seen so blatantly betraying its ally in a public event like this, the backlash would be immense. Genma couldn't imagine how stupid you would have to be to do something to turn public opinion of the village against you like that. The senbon chewing Junin's eye twitched. Now the kid was muttering to himself, as if he couldn't get any creepier already. He sighed dejectedly, running a hand through his hair as he swapped the side of his mouth he was chewing the senbon with. He wished he could just call the match already, but he had to give the girl at least some time to show up, however unlikely it was. Yeah, he was considerate like that, had to give the Konoha genin as much chance as possible, right? He blinked suddenly, feeling his eyelids begin to grow heavy, with those feathers falling from the sky. It was the shock of the senbon pricking the roof of his mouth that snapped him out of the genjutsu, jerking him upright as he saw panic and chaos begin to break out into the stands. His eyes widened in shock, realizing that the invasion that had been theorized, and all the Junin warned about, was actually happening. After Hayate had died he had assumed something was up, but to see it firsthand. His eyes only opened wider when he realized just who he was standing next to, the unstable Jinchuriki, in the middle of an invasion, in the center of a large, open space. When he abruptly pivoted to face the kid, he met a rather curious sight. Gaara was still standing there, but he almost seemed to be melting. At some point after the explosions and the genjutsu, the Suna Jinchuriki had been drenched from head to toe. Wet sand was sloughing off of his body like a second skin, turning a muddy brown color. The redhead himself seemed just as shocked, looking down at himself in confusion, a muttered word on his lips as they twisted into a snarl. Before anything could be uttered, an enormous, rather familiar-looking tail suddenly slammed right into the small boy's stomach. There was an almost pregnant pause, for Genma at least, before the diminutive sand wielder was sent careening back across the stadium, the sluggish wall of sand that had risen to protect him too slowly dropping uselessly back to the ground in a sopping heap of muck. Then, suddenly, Naruto was there, a smirk spreading his whiskered cheeks as he pulled his goggles up onto his eyes. The blonde cracked his neck once before looking up at the still shocked proctor whose senbon had nearly fallen from his mouth. I hope you don't mind if I take this one, he was going to be my next opponent anyway and well, the blonde grinned, but not a particularly pleasant grin. I don't want all that planning to go to waste, right? Genma blinked before shaking himself back into reality, his mind running a mile a minute. To be honest, against a raging Jinchuriki Naruto was probably their best bet, even if the blonde didn't know why. Plus, he brought up a good point, Naruto had literally been preparing a month for this fight. Yeah, sure, Genma finally managed, rather lamely too. Apparently that was all Naruto needed though as the teen smirked again and stalked off towards his target, the hulking, snake-like monstrosity he controlled slithering right after him. Genma only watched him go for a few moments before turning back to the more pressing issue, namely, the invasion. He was sure that if Naruto failed, or Gaara got too out of hand, he would know about it. They were Jinchuriki for a reason. Naruto felt his heart flutter as his pace picked up into a jog, suddenly jumping up and landing on the back of Ramia as she slithered forward, riding her undulating tail like a surfboard. Gaara only just seemed to be coming to his senses, having been recently slammed into a rather sturdy wall with only a wet supply of sand with the consistency of mud to lessen the impact. The redhead looked up, spotting his attacker and practically growling as he picked himself up. The wet, useless sand sloughed to the ground around him, quickly replaced by fresher, dry earth from the arena floor. Naruto noted that particular phenomenon as problematic, but not unaccounted for. Gaara, having been expecting another bodily attack like the one that had put him in this position, raised a wall of sand as Ramia shot forward faster than Naruto could run. However, it never came. The snake-like puppet stopped on a dime, the momentum flicking her tail forward so that the very tip, where a neat circular hole rested at the end of a metallic spike-like protrusion, almost brushed the wall of sand. Gaara was not expecting that, nor was he expecting the sudden blast of water that erupted from said hole. He was unprepared then as the water carved a great swathe through his defense, breaching the first wall and forcing the boy to bring up a second which thankfully stopped the blast, for him at least. Naruto simply smirked, having seen all he needed to in the fact that Ramia's water cannon could in fact breach Gaara's impenetrable defense. His pinky twitched ever so slightly and the metallic spike at the end of his puppet's tail rotated half an inch. Instantly, the blast of water, which was still trying to carve a swathe through Gaara's sand, tightened to the width of a coin. The redhead's eyes widened in surprise, stretching out the black rings around his eyes as the jet of water once again sliced right through his defense. It was weakened, but not stopped. All that meant was that instead of being neatly carved in two by the thin, pressurized water jet, he was simply smashed in the chest and sent crashing back into the wall of the arena, held there by the sheer pressure of the water. While he was experiencing crippling pain one moment, struggling bring in more sand to protect himself, it suddenly stopped the next. It didn't mean Naruto had stopped attacking though, as instead of a jet of crystal clear water bursting through his sand, it was a single metal pellet, smaller than the size of an average fist. It soared through the holes the water cannon had carved, landing at Gaara's feet and rolling to an anticlimactic stop just shy of his sandaled toes. The redhead blinked once, eyes glancing curiously down to gaze at the strange kanji-like symbols engraved across the pellet's surface for only a split second, but that split second was all it took. Because then it exploded. Sasuke growled in frustration as he watched the medic nin bustle about frantically, confined to his bed like he had been since he woke up, some time after his match. Everybody refused to tell him what was going on and why everybody was in such a rush. The hanging lights in the room shook faintly from distant tremors, and more wounded kept pouring in by the second. His neck ached and burned slightly for reasons beyond comprehension and he felt more irritated than ever. Hell, he didn't even know what day it was or how long he had been unconscious, although he wouldn't say long considering he wasn't in the Konoha hospital, but the small clinic in the stadium. Oi! Sasuke grabbed the closest medic nin that rushed past, hands glowing an inviting green, by the sleeve, stopping them in their tracks. What the hell is going on? It turned out to be a young gray-haired man wearing large spectacles, his hair tied back into a short ponytail. His eyes seemed to gleam as he turned, spotting Sasuke looking at him expectantly, before clearing his throat and smiling congenially. Sasuke thought he might look somewhat familiar, but he couldn't place where. It's an invasion, Sasuke-kun, from Suna and Oto if I understand correctly, the boy answered, pushing his glasses further up his nose as he spoke, causing them to gleam briefly in the shaky light. But I may be mistaken. I'm just a humble medic nin after all. An invasion. Sasuke muttered to himself in shock, not noticing the inquisitive and wholly unfriendly look the young medic nin sported for a moment as he glanced up to Sasuke's neck. You aren't hurt, are you? Experiencing any unusual pains or aches? The older teen suddenly pressed, leaning uncomfortably close to Sasuke and shocking the boy out of his disbelief. What? No, I'm fine, Sasuke growled, leaning back and away from the gray-haired boy who seemed to notice his discomfort and backed off slightly. Oh, I'm sorry, I've been rude. My name is Yakushi Kabuto, Genin. We met during the first task. I should take a look at you right now. You don't seem to hurt, so as long as I can verify you're well enough we can free up this bed and get you out into the fight where you'll be useful, okay? Kabuto smiled in a friendly manner, lowering Sasuke's unease. He wanted to get outside if there was a fight going on. Sure. Do whatever I guess, the Uchiha muttered, leaning back in the bed as Kabuto leant forward once again, his hand glowing green once more. If Sasuke had been paying a little more attention, he might have noticed it was not the warm, inviting color it had been before, but a sickly, mottled green that looked like dying grass. He certainly noticed when a kunai suddenly imposed itself between the two, forcing Kabuto's hand back lest the teen lose it. "What are you doing to my student?" Kakashi's voice cut in, causing Sasuke to look around in surprise. The man's headband was pulled up, revealing his furiously spinning Sharingan that was currently glaring at Kabuto with almost enough intensity to gouge holes through him. What do you mean, Hatake-san? I was just healing Sasuke-kun here. It's my job, right? Kabuto backed away suddenly, his hands raised defensively in front of him. Kakashi remained unconvinced, his hand beginning to hum with a faint blue glow as he stepped forward. "Don't lie to me, I recognize that technique well enough, or, this eye of mine does." The Sharingan user spat venomously, the blue glow beginning to crackle and chirp like somebody had loosed birds in the room. All of a sudden Kabuto's demeanor changed, like somebody had flicked a switch. Gone was the nervous, frightened teen, backing away from the scary Junin. In his place stood a confident young man wearing a devious smirk, gently pushing his glasses back up his nose. "Well, if I was found out by anybody, I'm at least glad it was you, Sharingan no Kakashi." When he shifted his spectacles they caught the light, completely whiting out his eyes for a moment. Shame, and Orochimaru-sama was so curious as to why his curse seal didn't take hold. Kakashi's eyes widened considerably at that little tidbit, making Kabuto's smirk only grow as he shuffled backward subtly. "What does Orochimaru want with Sasuke?" Kakashi growled, matching the suddenly confident younger teen step for step as the medic nin scattered around them. By now the blue glow in Kakashi's hand had erupted into a full Reikiri and stray arcs of electricity were erupting from his fist, leaving tiny craters in the floor where they struck. Oh, I couldn't pretend to see into the machinations of Orochimaru-sama's mind, but then, what does Sasuke have to offer anybody, really? Kabuto diverted with a smirk, the greenish glow around his hands dying away as he backed off. Kakashi's eyes narrowed dangerously. "The Sharingan then," the Junin muttered, more to himself than anybody else, although in the small room Kabuto heard him perfectly. "Well yes, that would be what I'd assume as well," the teen shot back smarmily, shifting his glasses again as Kakashi's other hand balled into a fist. "What is he planning?" the man tried to ask, only for at that exact moment a heavy explosion to go off somewhere overhead, shaking the room to the point where people had to throw their hands out to stabilize themselves. Kabuto on the other hand took the opportunity to grab a handful of scalpels resting on a nearby tray and flinging them at Kakashi with pinpoint precision. Kakashi just swiped at them with his lightning-infused hand, batting them away. By then, Kabuto had turned and fled from the room. Naruto coughed into his hand as he used the other to wave away the black smoke that smothered the area once occupied by the arena wall. Now it was just rubble, a gaping hole that could have fit a boss summoned through with ease. He was still surfing Ramia's back as she slithered through the downed masonry and chunks of stone, looking for any sign of the opponent he had lost in the blast. He hadn't quite expected it to be quite that big when he created the capsule. "Yeah, definitely got the calculations wrong," the blonde grumbled as the smoke began to lift and the dust settled, finally clearing his visibility beyond a few measly meters. The capsule was simple in theory and a little more difficult in practice. The basic idea was to stuff a small metal ball full of exploding notes, concentrating their blasts into one big boom. It was not quite that simple, but it was the general idea. The only reason it wasn't generally used was the cost. Explosive tags were rather expensive, unless you would create them yourself, that is. Even without that, Naruto had a rather steady flow of income now from Nami to provide the raw materials. He also used that flow of money for his puppet materials and tools, but that was beside the point. The simple fact was that he knew his weapon at least worked. Now it was simply an issue of refinement and getting the most explosive power from as few tags as possible, or the most bang for his buck as it were. Field test, success, I guess. Naruto admitted as he peered about, trying to catch a glimpse of the redhead somewhere in the rubble. If he was lucky he would have just been crushed, or blown up. But then, a part of Naruto had to admit that sounded rather boring. He really should have been more careful about what he wished for, because at that moment a thin tendril of sand suddenly wrapped around his ankle, flinging him away from his puppet. He was quick to react though, his fingers blurring as Ramia's tail shot round. the water cannon already cycling up as the thin stream of water neatly sliced through the tendril of sand particles, allowing Naruto to drop to the ground and roll to an ungraceful stop. He was rather grateful for the water cannon at that point, although he had been forced to gut more than a few of Ramia's weapons, especially in her tail, to build and integrate it. Worth it though, definitely worth it. It could slice clean through trees and could gouge through stone in a few seconds. Take that Suiten ninjutsu. Storage of the massive quantities of water actually proved to be the greatest issues in its construction, although as it tended to do, Fuinjutsu provided the answer. Storing a liquid still proved to be rather difficult compared to objects, all things considered. The blonde put that from his mind as he finally spotted his opponent come stumbling through the smoke, although not quite as he remembered him. Instead of the silently dangerous boy Naruto had been expecting to face, he only saw a maniacally grinning thing. Half of his body, seemingly chosen at random, was covered in sand, blue vein-like patterns running across its surface. A massive spiky tail swung methodically behind him and one of his arms had been completely replaced by a fat, lumbering, clawed hand that looked like it better belonged to an animal. The worst part was his face though. The sand had encroached across half of it, gruesomely widening his grin on one side where drool steadily dripped from vicious fangs. The eye on that side was also twisted, the sclera a jet black while the pupil was replaced by what appeared to be a yellow four-pointed shuriken. In all, it looked as though Gaara was halfway through a transformation into some kind of monster. The blonde was almost tempted to remember this and use it in creating his next puppet. He was snapped out of his internal thoughts when a huge tendril of sand suddenly smashed down on his position. He was only able to get out of the way because he was already standing so close to Ramia and she was able to take the brunt of the impact. It became quickly obvious that if he didn't do something soon, then there would be no next puppet to build. Gaara was not messing around anymore. The crazed, insane look in his remaining human eye told him that much. Your blood will feed mother. The boy cried out in a crazed, gravelly tone as another thick whip of sand smashed into the ground when Naruto had just been standing. This time he was at least wary and had the time to dodge, but he was not a physical person. If he was forced to keep ducking and weaving like this, then he would tire and make a mistake. No, he had to take the offense or he would die here in this rubble. The next time Gaara went for an attack, Ramia was suddenly there, her mouth opened as wide as it would go as she immediately spat wide globs of the same viscous substance that had been so effective in locking up Karasu's movements. Sure enough, it hit the wall of sand bearing down on Naruto and basically froze it in place, the quick-drying adhesive bonding every molecule of sand together and preventing it from having the liquid flow Gaara needed to properly control it. Now all the boy had was a large block of sand, a large block that was swiftly shorn through by a thin jet of water. Gaara cursed and hollered to this mother he was talking about as the powerful stream of pressurized water gouged great channels across his sandy body. However, even as Naruto chipped away at his defense, more sand rushed to replace what was damaged, encroaching further and further across the redhead's body. Naruto didn't particularly want to wait around to find out what the end result of this transformation was. It likely wouldn't be anything good for him. Yes, that's it, show me your strength so that I can crush it. The boy cried out again, only looking increasingly insane as almost all of his face was replaced by that sandy, animalistic mask. Naruto was forced to dodge again as the boy swiped his bulky, clawed hands at him, sending out a massive barrage of shuriken composed entirely of sand. Naruto didn't assume for 1 second though that when they hit them they would act like sand was supposed to. His thoughts were conformed as he spotted one of them shear right through the concrete wall of a nearby building. He dived onto Ramia's back, holding on tight as she slithered up a nearby wall and onto the rooftop, Gaara's crazed eyes following him the entire way. The Suna Jinchuriki was about to follow him, but stumbled mid-step, crying out in an ear-splitting tone as the sand running along his back suddenly burst away from him like it was attached to an ejector seat. The redhead's manic eyes swiveled in their sockets as he turned, coming face to face with Arakun as the spider-like puppet distended its jaw improbably wide. When the puppet spat another wad of innocuous clear liquid, Gaara simply raised his arm, expecting another burst of adhesive and forgetting the pain he had just experienced not moments ago, thanks to his hysteria. Instead of a harmless glue though, the liquid immediately began to hiss and steam as it struck the sand, eating right through it as Gaara's eyes widened in panic. What is it? It hurts, mother. It hurts. Gaara screamed hysterically, waving his arm madly as the acid continued to corrode right through his sandy defense. Naruto grinned from the rooftops, thankful that the sand was actually reactive to Arakun's acid. Not everything was. He guessed it was the chakra that was controlling the sand, causing the rather intense and, if Naruto said so himself, spectacular reaction. At that point something just seemed to click in Gaara's mind, and all at once the sand covering his body exploded outwards. It pelted Arakun with small, razor-sharp bullets of sand that ricocheted in all directions. Thankfully, the spider-like puppet held up okay against the onslaught. For that brief instance though, Gaara was completely unshielded, and Naruto, from his vantage point outside the attack's area of effect, saw that perfectly well. Arakun immediately scuttled forward, her legs clicking ominously as she closed the distance between Gaara and herself in a matter of moments. Then all Gaara could see was a flurry of black. Arakun worked furiously, rushing all around the small redhead as a thin, clear liquid was spewed from her abdomen, wrapping the boy up in increasingly tight threads that were hardening as fast as she was making them. Gaara struggled from the moment he felt something wet and sticky attached to his hand, and he didn't stop all the way up to the end when only his eyes, darting about madly, could be seen from within the white bundle of spider web he had become. The sand was still swirling around him ominously, as if confused about how to help its master, but it fell limply to the ground the moment Arakun bit into Gaara's neck, injecting a powerful sedative right into his bloodstream. There were a few more frenzied moments of Gaara thrashing about before the boy's eyes turned drowsy and he slumped back into Arakun's awaiting arms, asleep. From up on the rooftop, Naruto breathed a sigh of relief, feeling his target was adequately incapacitated. He even spared a look around at the chaos going on in the village. Konoha seemed to be pushing Suna and Oto back steadily. The damage to the buildings was only superficial at best, although the walls on the eastern side of the village had been completely caved in by what looked to be an enormous three-headed snake summon. He was rudely ripped from his inspection though, as the building he was standing on suddenly shook as though an earthquake had decided to rip through the village. Naruto wished it was only that though, as it quickly became obvious the cause of the disturbance was in fact Gaara, which should have been impossible because the boy was still unconscious. Sure enough though, sand, in great deluges, began to pour out of the earth, seemingly cannibalizing the ground itself to create more. He had Arakun back away as the sand fell over Gaara's prone body like a tidal wave, nearly flooding the street. As his other puppet rejoined him by his side, he could only watch in horror as the sand didn't just gather at Gaara's body, but began to grow, soaring upwards as those familiar blue markings began to snake across the surface of the construct. By the time it was finished, Naruto was looking up at an enormous tanuki created entirely from sand. It towered over the surrounding buildings, its great beady eyes blinking for a moment before its massive maw split open in a wide grin. Then it laughed, a great, thunderous noise that cut through the sounds of battle going on all around the village. Everybody looked up, regardless of nationality or occupation. They all looked up at the monolithic creature of sand that had sprang up within the confines of the village's wall. They also watched, transfixed with a mixture of awe and fear, as it brought one of its distended, ugly hands up only to bring it crashing back down on top of the nearest building, luckily not the one Naruto was standing atop. "I'm free." Its voice was terrible, a high-pitched yet booming cry that rang out over the sounds of even the most powerful jutsu. It shifted on its ungainly feet as its tail, the length of most clan compounds, crashed through an entire row of houses like they were built from matchsticks. They were reduced to nearly nothing in an instant. Rubble and great piles of sand were all that remained. This was carnage incarnate, destruction given form, and it froze Naruto in place as he watched it, wide-eyed. Who should I kill first? The blonde was only snapped out of it when the enormous tanuki shifted again, forcing the teen back and away before the building he was on was shattered like so much glass. Suddenly, the awe was gone from his face, replaced by an angry scowl as he watched the Beu wreak even greater havoc on the village. "Hey, I still need this village, you giant sandy asshole." It was rare for Naruto to lose his temper, but seeing the creature so indiscriminately tearing through his village, it filled him with intense indignation. Ramia's arm suddenly separated into two, the hand folding back as a long, hollow tube slid from her wrist, pointed right up at the creature's face. With a dull thwap, she fired a single metal canister in a great arc up towards its lumbering, grinning head. It didn't quite make it that far, but it did catch on the beast's shoulder. Argush. Naruto watched with unhidden satisfaction as the canister erupted, this time a safe distance off the ground. The explosion visibly rippled through the air, spewing great gusts of flame and sand in all directions as the beast's arm was rather forcefully removed from the rest of its body, falling harmlessly in the center of a street. Once again people looked up in shock and awe, wondering just what the hell had happened, none more so than the actual Bayu itself. "I'll kill you. I'll kill all of you." It rambled madly as it swung its remaining arm in all directions, casually flicking away the jutsu a squad of Anbu had been sending its way. Naruto remembered the exact moment when the victorious satisfaction in him swiftly turned into unparalleled regret as the beast's madly swiveling eyes suddenly locked right onto his comparatively diminutive form. "I'll kill you, you little bastard." It was enough to say that Naruto immediately regretted his rather rash decision. Hindsight was 20/20 after all. The blonde gulped as he suddenly found the beast's entire attention focused directly on him. He supposed this was what he wanted, but he really didn't. It was only made worse as he saw sand beginning to drain upward, rebuilding the beast's right arm worryingly fast. The moment the beast's eyes narrowed dangerously, his mind clicked into gear and suddenly he was moving, up and on Arakun's back as Ramia split away, going off in a different direction. There were a few more faint thwups as the half-snake puppet slithered off, followed by ear-shattering explosions as more parts of the giant tanuki were blown right off. Its pained howls and the thundering sound of its footsteps as it reeled were like music to Naruto's ears as he vanished into the shadows of a nearby street. Unfortunately, those parts were also regenerating from the plentiful earth all around the Bayu, and it only seemed to be getting faster as time went on, meaning the tanuki was only getting more powerful. Naruto knew it had to have a weakness. Everything had a weakness. Even as he thought this, he managed to spot a small red dot on the beast's forehead. He peered closer only to realize it was Gaara, poking out of the tanuki's forehead and conspicuously free of Arakun's webbing, somehow. Yet oddly, he was still unconscious. Naruto simply decided to take a leap of faith and decided that waking him up might get rid of this creature. He was at a loss at what else to do otherwise, and luckily, he had just the way. He grinned as his fingers danced, keeping a careful eye on Ramia as the puppet suddenly pivoted, tail flicking up in the beast's direction. The following water show was disappointing to say the least. Naruto must have used more water than he realized earlier because the seals lining Ramia's tail were clearly empty. He could refill them, but it would involve simply abandoning the Bayu to its rampage while he went to go and get some water from the lake in a nearby training ground. He gritted his teeth for a moment, mind reeling, even as the tanuki slowly regenerated. He needed to do something, and now. Something big, that could act as a distraction or even lure the sand construct over to the training ground itself. All he had were his two puppets to work with, his puppets and a whole bunch of rubble. Naruto's mind nearly ground to a halt as his eyes widened, new ideas surging through his mind. Idiotic, completely crazy, but brilliant ideas. His grin returned as Ramia slithered over to their position. He only had about half a minute before the Bayu restored itself completely. His fingers twitched and two nearly identical flaps opened up in the back of Arakun and Ramia's necks. Carefully, very carefully, he removed two nearly identical metal capsules lined with seals from the slots and switched them around. Making his puppet's parts more modular and interchangeable was definably one of his better ideas. Satisfied he was now prepared, the fingers of his right hand began to dance once more and Ramia slithered off. She would be the distraction. Ramia was armed with the explosive shells and now, Arakun's acid. She could move fast enough to dodge the large, clumsy attacks from the tanuki while peppering him with acid and explosions. It wouldn't last long though, as both were in limited supply, so he'd have to act fast. Luckily the Bayu took the bait, angrily taking off after Ramia as the snake-like puppet led it closer to the village's wall. In the meantime Naruto took stock of the rubble from houses and the stadium's wall all around him, his eyes glittering as he got to work. Arakun became rigid as he removed all but one thread from her body, he rested flicking up and grabbing a nearby lump of masonry, larger than Naruto was. He strained for a moment before picking up the chunk of rock, dumping it down atop another. Immediately Arakun did her job, firing out a wad of adhesive and binding the two lumps of rubble together. Already Naruto could see it coming together. It was going to be rough, it was going to be ugly, but it was going to be big. Shukaku snarled angrily at the tiny annoyance around his feet, slithering around just outside of his reach as it fired those tiny black things that caused him so much pain. Whenever he tried to grab the little worm, it spat at him, but it wasn't normal spit. No, the worm's spit burned, it bubbled and ate at his precious sand, so Shukaku tried to crush the little worm instead. But the buildings were in the way. The worm was using them to hide, so Shukaku crushed the buildings, grinning each time he crushed the worm too. The little people were also there, nothing more than ants, and they were annoying too. They threw fire to melt his sand and water to turn it to mud, but they might as well have been throwing rocks at him. His sand was everywhere, and he could always make more. He may have been the weakest of his siblings, but he was infinite. No, the real irritation was the worm, the one the other little human had sent after him. The lumbering tanuki blinked, wondering where that little human had gone, the one that thought it could take his arm away. He turned, only to see something rather curious. It was like a boulder. Shukaku had seen boulders before, but it was rather large, or was it just close? And why did it look so much like a fist? The next thing Shukaku knew, half his face was caved in as the enormous fist of crumbling masonry and stone crashed right through his sandy body. He roared, or would have if half his mouth wasn't missing, instead it came out as more of a high-pitched whine that was half garbled. His face quickly regenerated and he got a better view of what had hit him. But Shukaku didn't have a word for this thing, standing in front of him. It was standing, right. It looked like the little humans that were such irritations, but it was far from little. It towered over the buildings like Shukaku did, but not quite as high. Shukaku grinned at that as he took a lumbering step forward. It wasn't as big as him. He was bigger. Then the thing's fist slammed into his face again and Shukaku wasn't grinning anymore. No, he was snarling. He was angry. I'll kill you. His garbled, venomous voice cried out over the sounds of fighting in the village. As he reeled back, the massive stone man took a lumbering step forward to match him. Naruto grinned proudly up at the monolithic man of rubble and stone he had managed to throw together. It wasn't at the scale of the rampaging Bau, but it was still larger than most of the building in Konoha, held together by a shaky mix of gravity, the last dregs of Arakun's adhesive, and chemically enhanced spider silk. Once again, he threw out his chakra threads, latching them onto strategic points across the thing's body as roughly carved seals began to light up. Almost immediately Naruto felt like somebody was ripping the energy directly out of his body and he had to remind himself why he had never tried to build a puppet this large before. The hastily made seals were leeching at his energy like it was a fire and his chakra was the oxygen. Still, even with all that it refused to move, it may as well have just been a giant rubble statue for all the use it was to him if it couldn't move. The blonde growled as he tried to pump more chakra in, knowing it wasn't enough. No human could move this thing, it was impossible. But he had to move it or the beast would continue destroying the village. Normally, Naruto wouldn't care. In fact, he would tell himself that he did not care, but he only had one Konoha, he couldn't afford to lose it already. He growled again, pumping more in, more chakra, more energy, just more. Then, as though some invisible lever had been pulled deep within his core, energy flooded through him. More than he had ever felt before, more than he knew could exist. It burned through his coils and the previously bright purple threads supporting the monolithic puppet burned a deep orange to match. Then, miraculously, the puppet moved. It took a lumbering, ponderous step forward, rubble and stone falling from its body with each movement. It was an ugly, misshapen, barely human-looking thing, but it was big, and it could move. Oh, and apparently it could also punch quite effectively. The blonde panted heavily, sweat dripping from his body and drenching his clothes as he finally stumbled into the training ground, or at least Ramia did. About 2 minutes ago he had lost the energy required to move his legs. Simply making his monolith move burned up his chakra, including whatever this weird orange energy was, like gas on a fire. It had worked though. The Bau had taken the bait, following the enormous stone construct all the way out of the confines of the village and out into a nearby training ground. The puppet had managed to lose one of its arms in the process, its slow and clumsy movements unable to keep up with Shukaku's attacks, but it did its job and occasionally got a punch in for revenge. As it made that last step into the clearing, drawing the tanuki along with it, its job was complete. With an enormous sigh of relief Naruto finally allowed his threads to drop, and just like that the stone titan collapsed to the ground with an almighty crash. Behind it, the Bau began to laugh, cackling madly as it finally saw its latest annoyance drop, dead. The laugh turned into a grunt of annoyance as it spotted the small dot of a human down in the clearing. You. Naruto simply grinned tiredly as Ramia dunked her head into the lake, drinking up the water greedily. Me. The blonde agreed as his puppet's tail flicked up, visibly vibrating from the intense amount of water being flooded through it at such high pressures. He had wondered what would happen if he tried to control one of his ordinary puppets with this new orange chakra. The results were rather spectacular. Instead of a mere jet of water a few inches in diameter, what exploded from Ramia's tail was a concentrated deluge. In the 10 seconds that it was active, because that was how long it took to drain the entire lake, more than half of the sand tanuki's body was reduced to an unusable sludge. That included its face, as a moment later Naruto spotted the small red dot that was Gaara falling through the air, flailing madly before hitting the ground with a sickening crunch. The blonde allowed himself to breathe a final sigh of relief as he slumped back on Ramia's body, letting the puppet support him as his fingers tiredly commanded it to slither over towards Gaara's prone form. Luckily, he had been right, waking Gaara up had indeed stopped whatever the creature was. That the same wake-up had led to Gaara receiving what appeared to be a broken leg in the process was just icing. How? The small Sunanin managed through the pain as he clutched at his leg. How did you beat it? Naruto regarded Gaara for a few moments in confusion before patting the puppet underneath him. High-powered water cannon. How else? He joked weakly, feeling his consciousness slipping as he gave way to chakra exhaustion, but he held on. No, the redhead practically screamed before whimpering as he returned to his leg. It looked rather painful. How did you beat the loneliness? You are like me. At that, the blonde's eyes narrowed intensely, his own exhaustion forgotten for the moment. What do you mean I'm like you? Gaara didn't even seem to hear him, still whimpering into his leg and apparently whispering soft apologies to the same person he was talking to earlier. How did you beat it? How? I live for me, for mother. I live only for me. I love only me. The boy was clearly insane, rambling to himself while clutching at his broken leg. However, for whatever reason, Naruto felt a pull, an urge to answer. Who says I am not lonely? He growled out, fighting the sweet pull of unconsciousness as Gaara was seemingly snapped out of his insanity for just a moment, his bloodshot teal eyes darting up to Naruto's face. For the first time Naruto realized that the dark rings around the boy's eyes weren't just some kind of makeup, they were signs of sleep deprivation. But I'm nothing like you. He concluded, feeling himself slip with every passing moment. But then, Gaara tried, but apparently the words wouldn't come. A long time ago I decided that if people wouldn't acknowledge me, then I didn't need them. My own acknowledgement is enough. But it's never enough, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself. At this point Naruto wasn't sure if he was talking to Gaara, or himself. It was obviously the exhaustion. So instead, I decided I'd make others that had to acknowledge me, because I control them. Gaara nodded slowly, apparently something in there got through to him. Why you mean the puppets? His own voice was getting weaker as he too succumbed to the pain of his injury and slipped away into unconsciousness. As his eyes slid closed and he fell away into the blackness he missed Naruto's mysterious, if not tired, smile. Sure, the puppets. The blonde chuckled once, then fell backwards, finally allowing the sweet darkness of sleep to wash over him, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips. It started off as a simple thought exercise, it really did. Of course, as things tended to do when it came to him, it escalated rather swiftly. Later on, Naruto would look back and try to think just why the idea had come to mind. Few answers would present themselves. In the end it was an unknown, a small seed of an idea that was somehow planted in his psyche, growing as he fed and nurtured it until it overtook him completely. It was like a weed, quickly taking root, and damn near impossible to stamp out, a weed of the mind, bred of boredom and curiosity. How to start a war. 2 days after the failed invasion attempt from the joint forces of Sunagaku and the fledgling village of Otogaku, Naruto awoke in the hospital. The official reason given to him was severe chakra exhaustion, however Naruto knew that was a crock. He had felt chakra depletion before and it was nothing like this. Everything ached, his hands and fingers especially were covered in burns and were stiff to move, and his vision swam when he rose too fast. No, it felt more like he had tried to consume fire, only for it to incinerate his insides. All the same, Naruto felt restless. He disliked hospitals. Hate would have been too strong a word, as who could truly hate a hospital? They were there because they needed to be. They were like a puppet workshop for people, fixing and patching them up when they were damaged or worn out. Naruto still disliked them though. It was times like these, when he was incarcerated within their sterile walls, that dislike was most prevalent. It was made worse by the fact that the only prescription he had been given was rest. What nonsense, he could rest just as well in the comfort of his own home, surrounded by his puppets and in an environment where he wouldn't go insane from sheer boredom. Unfortunately, his aching body repelled his attempts to escape, so he lay there, alone, in the quiet, and did the only thing he could. He thought. He thought and thought and thought until he felt as though there was nothing left to think about. He replayed the battles in his head, tweaking his puppets mentally to maximize the abilities they could have displayed with more hindsight. For somebody as creatively inclined as the blonde, simply lying about and thinking was akin to torture. He needed to act on his ideas, or at the very least to write them down. In a hospital though, where anybody could access his room while he slept, he didn't dare. He was also rather starved for information, both domestically and internationally. He couldn't wrangle any news about the goings-on from the village from the nurses and med-nins, and likewise couldn't contact his spy network to find out the goings-on of the wider world. In that regard, it was no small relief when the Hokage decided to pop his head around the door, his pipe in hand and a congenial smile on his wrinkled features. He wasn't exactly the person Naruto most wanted to see, but it was certainly a welcome break from the monotony of his bed. He had begun to get weird ideas to escape. Hokage-sama, he greeted politely, as any good and loyal shinobi of Konoha would do. It caused Hiruzen's smile to widen slightly. Naruto-kun, I hope your recuperation is going well. The older man asked, shuffling in and taking a seat by the blonde's bedside like he owned the room, which, in a way, he did. I'm not disturbing your rest, am I? Naruto quickly shook his head, moving about awkwardly so that he could prop himself into a vaguely sitting position using the pillows. I could ask the same of you, Hokage-sama. As I understand it, you were injured during the invasion, by Orochimaru of the Sannin no less. Okay, so Naruto wasn't completely cut off from the information around him. He had his ways of picking up rumors and chat from the nurses. The elderly Kage simply chuckled, sucking on his pipe without actually lighting it out of respect for the establishment. I suppose then, in that regard, we are the same, the Hokage rebutted jovially, causing the blonde's eyebrow to raise before he remembered what the Oto team had said in the Forest of Death about their master. But you are quite well informed, Naruto-kun. Hiruzen inquired slyly, a gray eyebrow arched curiously. I overhear the nurses talking. It's mostly inane chatter, but there are gems, if you know what to listen for, Naruto said, perhaps a little too guardedly, making Hiruzen chuckle as his pipe switched sides. Quite. Well, there is no need to worry then. One of the other Sannin was there with me, and between us we were able to drive off my old student. The man seemed quite troubled as he spoke, despite his best attempts to hide it, and Naruto knew he would likely get no farther on the subject. This seems like an odd visitation, Hokage-sama. I would have thought that after the invasion the village would be most in need of your leadership. Not to mention the fact that I'm not exactly dressed for guests. The blonde motioned down his body, alluding to the fact he was clad in only a wispy hospital gown. He felt very naked without his hood and bulky clothing. Without them his various maladies were rather evident. The paleness of his skin was on full display, as was the thinness of his body, not to mention the dark shadows under his eyes despite his best attempts to use his hair to hide them. You would be quite right, the Hokage agreed with a curt chuckle. But if I was forced to work to the point I couldn't even visit one of my waylaid shunin after they did so much for the village, then I'm afraid the workload would have driven an old man like me quite mad a long time ago. Despite the fact it was worked into the sentence, Naruto did not miss the subtle hint strewn amongst the words. Shunin, Hokage-sama? Naruto asked with no small amount of incredulity. Surely post-invasion the exams should have been the least of the village's concerns. To his surprise the old man simply smiled, pulling a brand new forest green flak jacket out of seemingly nowhere and laying it across the hospital bed. Nothing gets past you, does it, Naruto-kun? The old man winked at him before patting the flak jacket fondly. Yes, despite the turmoil in the aftermath of the invasion, the village has not forgotten its genin. Given your performance, both within the exams and in light of the invasion, it has been decided that the promotion suits you. Naruto blinked, tentatively reaching across the bed to lightly run his fingers along the coarse material of the jacket. It was a symbol, one of status and prestige certainly, but more importantly it was a symbol of progression and of growth for Naruto. He realized he had been awkwardly silent for a long couple of moments. he supposed he was just in disbelief about it. After what had happened, he hadn't even considered the possibility of being promoted, and right now his mind was reeling with all the expanding possibilities opening up before him. Don't worry, it tends to be a lot to take in at first, but I assume this means you accept. The Hokage prompted helpfully, secretly amused by the confusion rampant across the younger shinobi's expression. Why yeah, Naruto managed to get out before finally realizing how much of a fool he looked and composing himself. Thank you Hokage-sama. The old man simply nodded, still sporting that amused smile as he stood up. Well, in any case I'll have to be off. You weren't the only one to be promoted, you know. Upon Naruto's inquisitive gaze, the older man's smile broadened but only taped his nose secretively. He knew Naruto would find out eventually. The blonde had a knack for that type of work, but it was fun to make him wait a bit. Then he was gone, and Naruto was left to his thoughts once more, only they were far more tumultuous than before. Shunan, the young puppeteer, whispered slowly to himself, hands still lightly tracing over the stitching on the jacket. The mere thought of what the position meant was still taking its toll on his thoughts. Freedom, first and foremost, came to mind. He was no longer under the watch of a Junin and instead would be placed onto squads of other Shunin of varying sizes as the mission saw fit. He could now also pick his missions unless explicitly called upon when his specific expertise was required. Considering his rather specific set of skills, that would actually be rather likely. After all, the village only had one puppeteer. Freedom, prestige, that was also an aspect. He could now access more of the village's library and certain installations about the village because of his rank. But then, respect, he was no longer the lowest rung on the totem pole. He had seniority over any and all genin. What do I, privilege? He could now take much harder and more rewarding missions, not in the realm of A or S rank of course, but still more challenging. Want to do. And just like that, his mind ground to a halt, once again recycling back to that original thought of freedom. Suddenly there were options, choices and multiple paths for him to take. But then, of course, arose the question of just what it was he wanted to do. The answer was simple, wasn't it? His goal had never changed. To become the strongest puppeteer, like Sasori. This was simply the first step forward. For the first time ever though, Naruto was spoiled for choice about which direction he could take. The next few years would likely be grueling mission after mission as he earned enough esteem and power to advance once more in rank. Short of a war of course, in which case, he could earn a field promotion. That was how Sasori had risen to fame as Akasuna no Sasori after all. And there it was, the very beginnings of an idea that would only spiral further out of control, a seed planted in all too fertile soil that was more than happy to take it in for nurturing. Of course, at that moment a nurse walked in to check on him and his train of thought was derailed, but as he would later learn, an idea was a persistent thing. Actually, it wasn't just persistent, it was damn near parasitic. A few days later, when Naruto was finally released from the hospital, he found that niggling thought always in the back of his mind. Even when he sat down for some much-needed maintenance of his puppets, it was right there. War. It was such a simple, complicated, wondrously horrible thing. If a war came around, it would be just perfect for him. War evened the playing field for everyone. A war made rank irrelevant compared to skill and power. Wars had been where the greatest shinobi of legend had both made a name for themselves, and risen to power. The Senju brothers, Uchiha Madara, the Sandaime, Sanshou no Hanzo, the Sannin, the Yondaime, even Kakashi earned his moniker during the Third Shinobi War. Sasori too, he was famous for bathing the sands of Kase no Kuni with the blood of Tsunagoku's enemies during the Third Shinobi War. Still, war was not such a convenient thing that Naruto could simply will it to be, and thus the thought experiment began. It was purely out of curiosity at first, just the idea of how one would go about orchestrating a war. It was not a single thought, nor did Naruto constantly think of it across his day-to-day activities. No, ideas would come and go, seemingly with random or inconsistent bursts of inspiration. First, of course, would be the question of just who he would want this war to be waged between. Obviously, a war fought between two nations not including Konoha would be useless, but that did not exclude the prospect of Konoha being dragged in. However, considering the fact that, of its two allies, neither were particularly viable in that regard, this train of thought was soon dropped. Given the recent attack from Tsunagoku, their status as an ally was dubious at best, and Takagoku was notoriously neutral as far as wars went. The chances of their participation were slim. Sometimes he just sat in his room, idly spinning about on his chair and throwing kunai at a large map of the elemental nations. Thud. Iwagakure. It was tempting. The relationship between Iwa and Konoha was already shaky thanks to almost 3 generations of fighting and grudges culminating in the Third Shinobi War. On the other hand, any war started between those two superpowers was likely to get drawn out, spill over into other countries and generally get out of hand. No, something a tad more controllable would be best, not to mention orchestrating it through rain and grass country would be awkward. Thud. Sunagakure. Interesting, but Naruto couldn't help but chuckle a little when the kunai managed to land right on the dot representing the hidden village. Starting up a war with Suna would probably be quite easy given their recent betrayal, but it was like picking on the runt of the litter. Right now, both economically and in terms of manpower, Sunagakure was undoubtedly the weakest hidden village of the 5 great powers. Any dedicated war on that front would be swift, over too quickly to be of any use. After all, the end goal was not the war, but what the war could do for Naruto. Thud. Omegakure. Unacceptable. It would only drag Iwa in and then he was back to the same problem as before. In that regard, Kasagakure was out too. Thud. Kirigakure. Naruto did consider this one for a while. Their remote location and notoriety for being unassailable in wars would certainly drag out any conflict. Tensions between Kirigakure and the rest of the world were also quite high due to their isolationism and rumors of a civil war. That instability would only make it easier to fan the flames of war. Unfortunately, there were too many unknowns. Very little information emerged from the Misty Islands and Naruto hadn't the foggiest about their power structure, the status of their civil war, or even really who was fighting who. Thud. Yugakure. Naruto almost wanted to laugh and immediately disregarded the little demilitarizing nation. Thud. Kumogakure. Naruto's interest was piqued. He even leant forward on his chair as he stared up at the mountainous peninsula that was Kaminari no Kuni. There was certainly bad blood between the two nations, especially in recent years with various attempts made by Kumogakure shinobi to kidnap clan and bloodline children. Hell, they had nearly done the job for him a few years ago with the attempted kidnapping of the Hyuga heiress, that had damn near sparked a war on its own. In spite of that, relations between the two villages were unusually stable. That, though, was mostly due to the buffers called the Lands of Frost and Hot Springs, two smaller nations nestled between the two superpowers. They limited the interaction between the two shinobi forces which, in turn, kept tensions down. Generally, when two opposing forces of shinobi from different villages met in the same area, it was because their missions were either in direct conflict, or the same, and neither was good. Of course, usually that would make igniting the spark of war between them rather difficult. Things were changing though. That uneasy peace was beginning to wear thin and show cracks. The recent demilitarization of Yugakure had bereft no Kuni of its shinobi, forcing them to instead take missions from Konoha, the closest benefactor. The same was also true for Shimo no Kuni. They too relied on the shinobi Kumogakure provided. What this really meant though, was that for the first time since the First Shinobi War, Konoha and Kumo shinobi were actively operating in countries without a buffer. Already, through his spy network in Nami, he had received reports of escalating incidents along the Yu-Shimo border. In fact, Naruto was fairly certain that even without his intervention a war was looming on the horizon. Giving things that little extra kick shouldn't have proven too difficult. The blonde blinked suddenly, realizing as he looked down at the clock on his workbench, that he had been deep in thought for nearly half an hour. He rubbed at his eyes and chuckled. He had been pretty deep in his little logic game there. Cracking his back, he stood up, last kunai swinging lazily around his finger. Without a backwards look he tossed it behind him at random before slinking off to bed. Even he had to sleep sometimes. He never noticed the dull thud as the kunai seared right through the small leaf marker representing Konoha. It should have ended there really. Under better, or maybe just different circumstances, it might have. It was a fun brain teaser, an interesting little side project to mull over when he wasn't working on his puppets or taking on missions as a shunin. He had reached a metaphorical wall in the form of manpower, the little snag in any would-be warmonger's plan, hypothetical or not. After all, there was no way Naruto could orchestrate the series of increasingly delicate events required to autonomously trigger a war on his own. He would need people, resources, time, and unfortunately, or fortunately given the right perspective, he lacked the crucial element of people. Oh sure, he had a spy network, a faithful and rather diligent one at that, in the form of the shipping nexus of Nami. He doubted he could get them to initiate a war for him though, he also wouldn't particularly trust them to either. No, he would need people he could explicitly trust, people who could work independently from him and yet still work towards his goals and his alone. People who would in no way betray him or even have reason to do so. People like that just didn't exist unless you were the cage of a hidden village. If only he could create breathing, living, thinking copies of himself. Except he could. It was coincidence, nothing more. However, he would later look back upon the event as some kind of divine intervention, or more likely, something of a more malicious nature. He had never been one for the bedtime stories of Kami and Oni, but he would not have been adverse to their occasional interference. It was a routine mission, the actual briefing would be lost to his memory, but he would always vividly recall one particular moment. It was with a squad he had never worked with before, having only been assigned because the mission passed close to the border with Suna. He tended to get those missions quite a bit thanks to his supposed inside knowledge on their puppeteers. It was evident though that the squad was rather tightly knit. He could see it in the easy and casual way they went about setting up camp for the night. Those details had been irrelevant. It was the moment the squad leader, a mousy-haired man with a rather forgettable face save for a jagged scar on his lip, had motioned for a younger Shunin, only a few years Naruto senior, to scout out the area. The girl, with long black hair tied back into a rather painful-looking ponytail, had simply nodded before forming an odd hand seal Naruto had never seen before. In an instant, there were 3 more of her, quickly vanishing off into the brush as one. At first the blonde had simply thought it was some unique way of performing the Bunshin technique. However, that was before he noticed that each of the clones had disturbed the ground in some way in their hasty departure. Normal clones did not do that. Naturally, being a rather curious individual by most accounts, he asked the squad leader about it. The man, who had been initially quite cold and distant from the teen until Naruto had shown him he was capable of pulling his weight, was surprisingly eager to explain, hints of patriotic pride lacing his voice. Naruto knew why just minutes later as he sat back on that tree stump, just taking it all in. Autonomous, solid clones capable of using chakra, thinking independently from the user and relaying information they collect when they disperse. The older Shunin seemed rather smug at Naruto's astonished face. It was likely due to the fact the technique was unique to Konoha thanks to the Nadaime Hokage. Naruto could have cared less about the jutsu's history, more than its application. Suddenly that little snag he had run into was gone, it was no longer a problem. The Shunin had refused to teach the technique to Naruto of course, citing massive chakra drain, but that mattered little. Naruto had seen the hand sign, all it would take was sufficient practice and the technique would be available to him. And there it was, that parasitic little thought that had slowly been dying in the darker corners of his mind was given that little bit of nourishment it needed to start kicking and making noise again. This time it would not be ignored. The next few weeks passed by in somewhat of a blur for the avid puppeteer. Everything else suddenly seemed unimportant in comparison. He still took missions of course, performing excellently and to the standards expected each time, as was only proper. He still worked on his puppets, designing and improving as situations demanded through his increasingly varied experience in missions. Although they lacked the usual flair and creativity he prided himself on as a kind of pseudo artist, his mind was too occupied elsewhere. It took surprisingly little time to get the actual technique itself down, although it was a bit awkward without any kind of instruction. The chakra molding was complicated and tricky without explanation as he only knew the one-hand seal. Still, the blonde was no stranger to having to learn by trial and error, and his unusually large chakra capacity helped in that regard. He learned it quickly enough, but that was not why he was distracted. The technique itself fascinated him. He didn't care so much for how it worked, despite the name itself being somewhat of a misnomer. After all, these were no mere shadows, they might as well have been him save for their unusual frailty, a fact the Shunin who first told him about them failed to mention. No, instead he was transfixed by the clone's limits, as well as the limits they in turn imposed upon him when they were used. It was experimentation that took up the majority of his thoughts in that overarching time period. He quickly found out that he could leave a shadow clone operating autonomously with only light activity for around 6 days before their chakra would run out and they would naturally disperse. He had his theories though that this was a form of safety mechanism. It had given him a rather nasty migraine to have all that information poured into his head at once. He imagined much longer and he could have actually caused himself quite a bit of damage. He tended to think of his brain as quite a bit too valuable to go damaging like that. He also learned that trying to learn multiple things at once was useless, proved by having two clones read two different books and dispersing at the same time. The information that he received was garbled and mostly unintelligible, making for some very odd, disconcerting and sometimes quite amusing memories. Having them disperse at a safer interval of around 20 minutes or so gave him enough time to sort through one set of memories before dealing with the next. He made a mental note not to ever disperse more than 4 or 5 clones at once if they had been active for more than a few minutes. Then came numbers, and Naruto was rather surprised to find he could create upward of 500 shadow clones with relative ease. He had heard it was a particularly draining jutsu and that many Junin struggled with even 20 or so. Far from delighted though, Naruto was particularly disconcerted by the new information. As far as he understood, a human should not have been able to split their chakra in so many ways without serious repercussions. It drudged up old memories better left forgotten within his psyche, too many distracting emotions tied along with them. Forgotten recollections of being called various unpleasant names when he was younger, especially by other children in the park. Freak, or weirdo, were often prominent amongst such taunts, and they suddenly reverberated within him now as he thought on his unusual chakra capacity. He had always known about it, of course. It was hard to miss after lessons in the academy left the other children exhausted while only mildly winding him. Normally these thoughts would quickly pass as he mentally slapped himself and got back to whatever he was doing. It was a kind of self-motivation that, while probably not all that healthy, was quite effective with somebody as stubborn as he was, especially when he was younger. Something had changed though. He had changed. He had met Gaara. The Suna shinobi's words resonated with the blonde and he was unable to pry them from his mind. "You are like me." That phrase stuck out amongst the ramblings and the deranged threats. "You are like me." At first he had rationalized it away as the boy's obvious insanity. It was clear he was not stable. "You are like me." It dug at him though, made him question it. Especially after the discovery of the strange orange chakra within him. He hadn't tried to use that chakra since, remembering the burn and fatigue that accompanied it, but suddenly memories of the feeling were all he could think about. That chakra had allowed him to do inhuman things, controlling a puppet that by all rights should have been impossible to move. Inhuman, like his chakra reserves, like his odd whiskers that he barely noticed anymore looking in the mirror, like his ability to heal much faster than most others and survive poisons that should have left him catatonic. "You are like me." But how was he like Gaara? That boy had been insane, a real freak, capable of unleashing a literal monster at will just by falling asleep. "You are like me." The words just kept echoing in his mind over and over. But how? He growled back in answer to a question nobody had asked, spinning on his chair in frustration. For a second though, out the corner of his eye, he caught sight of his reflection in the mirror, except it wasn't his own. Bright blonde hair was replaced by a rusty red, the shadows under his eyes extending all the way around until he resembled a raccoon, whiskers vanished. It was Gaara's face. Naruto nearly fell out of his chair in shock. When he looked again nothing was wrong. His hair was blonde, the shadows were only those of the average insomniac, and his familiar, forgettable whiskers were right back in their place on his cheeks. However, looking into his own eyes he couldn't help but shudder as a brief chill passed up his spine. He could have sworn for a moment there, flickering like a dying candle, his eyes had briefly become slitted, more animal than human. Naruto sighed as he slunk through his apartment door, running a hand through his hair wearily. He casually shucked his jacket and threw it across the room in a well-practiced motion. Instantly, a shadow clone was there to catch it and put it away. They were rather handy things to have around. It certainly made organizing the apartment quick and easy. He casually sidestepped a tarp that had been laid down from where two clones were in the midst of knocking through a wall and slipped comfortably into his chair. Despite his exhaustion he couldn't find it in him to keep the smile of his face. It was finally complete. It was almost 3 months since the end of the Shunin exams and Konoha had completely recovered. 3 months of planning in between missions and various other projects Naruto now had on the go. Shadow clones really made everything easier. Multitasking was now no harder than willing another into existence and handing them the job. Of course, designing and building original puppets he kept for himself. There was something to be said for the feel of wood under his hands and the satisfaction of building a new creation. The spare parts, copies and manual labor on the other hand he could have done without, so he did. He didn't think he would ever have to worry about running out of puppets in the field. Combined with his funds from NAMI, he now had an autonomous, well-funded workforce that knew exactly how he liked things. He was one content puppeteer. His crowning achievement, however, lay on the wall before him, crisscrossed with so many pieces of string and various papers, some with only hastily jotted notes and others with maps so carefully plotted they would look as good as any architect's blueprints. It was the plan, as he, and disconcertingly his clones, had taken to calling it. Everything he would need to start a war between Kumogakur and Konohagakure lay on that wall, as long as you knew how to read it, of course. To the uninformed it would look like nothing more than a mishmash of notes dispersed amongst various designs and incomprehensible maps. When it had stopped being a mere thought exercise and had escalated into a full-on plan of action was unknown, perhaps even irrelevant. But it was done, and Naruto felt content. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.